The number one issue that any mix will have will be related to the kick and bass in some way. If your kick and your bass are not mixed right, like they're drowned out in the mix or they're muddy, your entire mix will lack energy. Or in other words, your entire mix relies on how well you mix around the kick and bass. So here's 5 tips to make sure your kick and bass are always mixed right. Tip number 1 is pick the right kick that complements your bass. I know it sounds easy, but for some reason, a lot of amateur producers consistently get this wrong. So here's what you could do to get it right. When you're picking a kick for your song, create at least 5 MIDI or software instrument tracks. Make sure each of these have a sampler loaded up on them. And then for each track, pick a different kick that you think would work well in your song. Then we're going to take one of your sampler tracks and then just write a kick line. And what this allows us to do is audition each kick quickly. And what we're looking for is the kick that complements the bass line the best. So when you're listening to kicks, when you're auditioning kicks, you should be listening to how good the low end of each kick sounds. Every kick has high frequency information, and that matters, but getting a kick that sits right down here is where you should focus more of your attention, because this area of the kick is what's going to sound good on club speakers and car speakers and really translate the best to any system that your listeners will be listening to your music on. By the way, guys, it's my 30th birthday, and I'm offering 30% off my EDM Bootcamp packages to thank you all for letting me live out my dream and do music for a living. I'm so grateful for the last 10 years of all the love and support. Here's the 30.
Blow them out.
Book a call below to claim your discount. Let's get back to the video. Tip number 2 is to sidechain. Sidechaining means to reduce the volume of an instrument when another instrument is happening. The kick and the bass are both sub-bass focused instruments, and sub-bass frequencies are the most delicate frequencies in the whole mix. This means that you can only have one instrument satisfying the sub-bass frequencies at a time. If you have more than one instrument happening in the sub-bass frequency range, this will cause mud and phase cancellation. Both of those things do not sound good. So what we need to do is sidechain the bass to silence itself when the kick happens. And we do this with either an LFO or a compressor. I'm going to use an LFO called Shaperbox, which you could really only use in a house beat or 4 on the floor. Any other standard kick rhythms, you would have to use a compressor. So if we look at our kick, we need to make the bass line go away for this much time. And so what I'm going to do is add this LFO to my bass line and then just carve out that space where the kick is going to exist. And so we listen to my bass line now. And if we play the kick and bass together, both the kick and the bass are undisturbed. And once you get your sidechain working like this, you can decide how aggressive or subtle that sidechain signal is. I like a less aggressive sidechain signal. So now what's happening here is that my bass isn't completely getting silenced every time a kick happens, it's just reducing a little bit in volume. So without our sidechaining plugin, if we just focus on the sub frequencies, the kick adds very little dynamics to the bass line. It's actually not that muddy. But if I turn on my sidechaining plugin, that's the punch that I'm looking for. And I know that that punch will be really enhanced on club speakers, car speakers, and any system that your listeners will be listening to your music on. Okay, so once you've picked a kick and you've sidechained it, you're still not in the clear. You're only part of the way there. The next tip is to add a low cut or low reduction filter to every instrument besides the kick and bass, and sometimes snare. This tip alone, when it's not done right, will ruin most amateur mixes. So as I said earlier, the sub-bass frequencies are delicate, and the kick and the bass line are the only two instruments that can use that range. The problem is that most of the other instruments in the song will leak low frequency information into the sub frequency range. For example, here's a set of chords. Look at all the low frequency information that is leaking from the chords. They have no business existing down here. This is where the kick and bass exists. Here's another example in the same song. Here's a synth lead. Look at all of the low frequency information that is spilling over into the sub bass. The problem we have in digitally produced genres like pop, hip hop, and electronic genres is that we use so many more samples and instruments than other classic genres of music. And the result of this problem is that all of those frequencies add up and take away from the sub bass. So here's a bass line coming together with the chords without any low end reduction on the chords. You can't even hear the bass at all. So what we want to do is we want to grab an EQ, put it on the chords and every other instrument in the mix besides the kick, bass, and snare, and then just reduce or eliminate any frequency from these instruments up to 120 to 150 hertz. And you really want to use your best judgment to decide how much or how little of these low-end frequencies you reduce from every instrument. And you find the best balance you can that will allow that bass to shine through. It's amazing, just that little edit to the chords, and I can hear the bass perfectly. Next tip is to balance into the kick and bass and mix around them. If you do this right, you can't mess this up. Now, I can go really deep on this subject like I do in my courses, but I'm going to try to sum it up as best as I can for this video. So once you picked a good kick and you sidechained your kick and bass and you reduce the low frequencies of your other instruments, time to bring everything together. So what I like to do when I'm balancing is I start with the kick and bass and then balance everything into those things. So now my drums and my kick and bass, they sound good. Let's go ahead and bring other instruments like the chords in. I'm always focused on the bottom end of the kick and that bass line. And it doesn't matter what instrument I bring in, I should always be able to hear my kick and my bass perfectly. And this brings me to my final tip, and this is the most important. If you balance and mix around your kick and bass, and your bass especially starts to get muddy or it starts to disappear under all of the instruments, you have a problem. And those problems can only be any of the problems I discussed in this video. And they are that you didn't remove enough low-end frequencies from your other instruments, or you didn't sidechain good enough and your kick is having trouble shining through, or back to tip number one, your kick and your bass just aren't the right sounds. But it's probably most likely going to be related to the EQing thing and the sidechaining thing. So put all of your energy into getting the kick and the bass sitting right in your mix, because any issue with the kick and bass are going to hold your mix back the most. There are other issues you're going to have when mixing, but if you get the kick and bass right, you will at least be pretty close to getting a solid mix. That's a video for you guys. If you would like more tips on achieving elite level mixes, make sure to check this video out here. And as always, stay tuned for the next video.